Hello and welcome to our presentation over persuasive basics. I have to apologize because we are going to go through this fairly quickly. YouTube limits us to 15 minutes or less, so I apologize for us going so quickly, but remember you can always pause, rewind, or fast forward as needed. You also have the presentation online to look through on your own. Here are the basic questions that we're looking through on persuasion. We'll be defining it, why it's tricky, and looking at honest and dishonest persuasive methods. Persuasive writing, we'll look at our primary focus, how we aim our arguments, and some basic do's and don'ts. The philosophy of persuasion comes to us from the Greeks, mainly Plato, who looked at persuasion as a way of directing someone's soul by talking. Strong persuasive speakers in Greek times were considered to have mystical abilities, and in fact the Greek word for persuasion, psychagogia, meant to place the mind under a spell. This is a tricky form because persuasive arguments are not always true. We tend to think of persuasive arguments as being right or wrong, but they aren't. That's a backwards way of looking at it. Trial lawyers, for example, don't necessarily argue the truth. They only have to argue what seems most likely to be true. So persuasive arguments are not right or wrong. Instead, they are evaluated as either weak or strong. That is why, when we look at what makes a strong argument, we tend to focus on evidence. Propaganda is the idea of looking at dishonest persuasive methods. You've probably heard of a lot of these before. We'll go through them fairly quickly. Simply put, propaganda is manipulation of language or symbols for the purpose of controlling and regulating an audience's thoughts. So it goes beyond ordinary persuasion because it doesn't just aim to convince, but to control. So these are some very quick reviews on propaganda methods. Ad hominem attacks. So if we ask somebody, what do you think of Senator X's economic plan, and they responded, he's just a robot who votes the party line, well, the definition in that case is we avoid dealing with the issues and instead attack the target personally. Anytime you see personal attacks rather than a discussion of the issues, that's an ad hominem attack. Bandwagon is one that we're all familiar with because it's the majority of advertisements. Simply put, it's peer pressure. We play on humanity's natural tendency to want to feel part of the crowd. Begging the question occurs when we don't give the complete information and we treat the other person like an idiot. Act as though the argument is so obvious we don't need proof to support it. So if you hear someone saying, well, why are you still asking me this? It's obvious to everyone else. Then in that case, they're trying to bluff. They don't know the complete response themselves. Card stacking occurs when we tell the person that, well, we told all the good information, but we neglect the details that might alarm them. So our example here, the parent asks, where are you going? And the child says, well, the newest Star Wars movie is at the local theater. Well, what has not been said here is whether the child is actually going to that theater. I admit this is a case from my own childhood where I told my parents exactly this sort of thing, and I didn't tell them that I'd be driving off to the big city and going to see the movie there. So we say everything that supports the concept, we leave out the details that might alarm people. Euphemism is a very popular form of dishonest persuasion. Gas prices have been adjusted again, global climate change. During the Cold War, we had several thousand peacekeepers. Peacekeepers, for those of you who don't know, are another way of saying intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads. So we take a word or a phrase that has negative connotations, we replace it with a word or a phrase that has positive or neutral connotations. In other words, we say things that we don't want to upset our audience. A false analogy. We compare two things that have nothing in common. People who need a cup of coffee to get them going in the morning are no better than alcoholics. Coffee addiction is not the same as alcoholism. We don't see too many intervention shows about double espresso lattes, for example. Senator X's education policy is like the Hitler Youth Program in the 1930s. Notice, please, no U.S. politician, regardless of party, has ever done anything to warrant a comparison to Hitler or the Nazis. Never make a Nazi comparison, please. As soon as I see a Nazi comparison, typically I stop reading the argument or post or whatever it is. So again, a false analogy is comparing two things that have nothing in common. A false dilemma, clean your room or be grounded. America, love it or leave it. We create a false either-or situation. It's a way of manipulating people because we give them one option that we want them to do and one that they don't want to do. Of course, they're going to choose the one that is least likely to cause them harm. Faulty cause and effect. This is kind of a silly example here, but basically what it boils down to is that we state or imply a cause and effect relationship even though no correlation exists. There's a link on here to a site called Spurious Correlations. It looks at kind of fun, coincidental statistics. I highly encourage you to follow the link and have some fun with that. Flattery. Oh, you guys are my favorite Comp 1 class. I'm glad that you're watching this. We distract people from questioning us by telling them how wonderful they are. Glittering generalities, things like for the sake of the children, family values, organic, naturally grown. These are words or phrases that have positive connotations but are ultimately meaningless. We talk about organic, for example. If it's from this planet, it's organic. Doesn't really mean much of anything. Name calling. Unfortunately, that's all too common these days. Liberal, fascist, tree hugger, conservative. Name calling, we think that it's a way of attacking, but that's actually an ad hominem attack. Instead, name calling is effective because if we convince our audience to just see labels, then our audience does not see any human beings anymore. It makes it easier for our audience to hate our opponents. And remember, this is dishonest persuasion, so that's not something that we want to be doing in our writing. Plain folks appeal. Every president, every politician does it. Notice that President Obama here was wearing a bomber jacket, military jacket, standing in front of the troops. Writer acts like, or speaker acts like he or she is just like one of us, shares our values. Again, every politician does this. Simple plain folks appeal. Statistics. People are often confused with graphs and numbers. They are powerful because we tend to automatically trust numbers. Transfer is a little bit trickier when people say things like Barack Hussein Obama, or if you're from Kansan, Kris Kobach, Hussein. This, if people do not like people of the Muslim faith, this is technically a racist argument. They're trying to get us to associate the former president with Muslims, and therefore, yeah, it's kind of a silly argument. Likewise, people who do not like the Secretary of State, Kris Kobach, he has some policies that arguably target minorities. So sometimes you'll hear people say Kansan Kris Kobach, trying to emphasize the KKK in his name. Either way, it's an unfortunate attack on the person that doesn't actually discuss the issues. Government-run schools versus public schools is a new popular one. You don't want to be seen hanging out with those people. On the positive side, if we say that someone's ideas was in the spirit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this is an allusion to the Declaration of Independence. So, positive transfer, we transfer positive emotions to things that we want the audience to like. Negative transfer, we transfer emotions to things that we want the audience to hate. Again, if we have people who don't like the government, we call public schools government schools, so that way people tend to start hating public schools more. Kind of silly when you think about it, but this is how people are manipulated. Testimonial is a very simple one. We use endorsements from celebrities or respected organizations to sell a concept. Now, the only effective weapon against any of these, really, no, it's not truth, it's not force, it's not more propaganda, it's questions. If we question what's going on, we'll start to see through propaganda's manipulations. We mentioned these in our previous week, the 3 types of honest persuasion: ethos, credibility. Remember that establishes our moral or official authority. Pathos shows that the writer, speaker, whomever, cares about the audience. And logos, the argument is logical and it makes sense. It presents the argument in a way that makes sense to the audience. So our primary concern as persuaders is always going to be our audience. Knowing the audience should shape our strategy. Different audiences require different strategies. If we understand the audience, that leads to success with the greatest number of people persuaded. So, for example, on the left side over here, we might have people who completely agree with us. On the right, we might have people who completely disagree with us. Ideally, we should be looking at something like this. Something that hits the middle quite a bit, but notice we get diminishing returns. What we don't want to do is set up an argument, something more like this, or worse yet, like this. Notice how much of our audience we've lost as a potential if we just argue the extreme side. We aim for the center. That means that we have to know the weaknesses of our thesis. We have to be able to respond honestly to it. We have to know the strengths of the counterargument. We have to be able to respond honestly to that. And we have to be respectful at all times of the other side. If we start demonizing the other side, the center people get turned off. We just alienate the center. We preach to the choir. So 6 basic tips for successful persuasion. Always support your arguments with specific examples. Always aim for the center and respect the other side. Do not preach. Take out forms of you. Forms of you do not belong in academic writing. Write assertively. Audiences sense weakness. This means that we need to take out things like I think, I feel, to me, in my opinion. Consider the difference between the phrase, the movie was awful, versus I think the movie was awful. The first one, it's a lot harder to argue against it. Watch out for aggressive, whining, sarcastic, or defensive tones. I know if I hit a blood pressure topic, I get extremely sarcastic, for example. Use a combination of credibility, emotion, or logic. If we're too emotional, it becomes a rant. So, that is our very quick screencast over persuasive tips and basic persuasive writing instruction. I hope that you'll use these tips so that you can write a strong academic essay with credible research and a good tone. Let me know if you have any questions.